It takes courage to speak truth to power and humility to listen and learn from others. I am beyond excited to have meaningful conversations with respected authorities and experts from various international organizations and governments around the world. This is Mona Brea, and you are listening to the Thought Leaders and Game Changers podcast. Joining us today is the former director of the Reform Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund. He has worked with fiscal authorities worldwide on issues ranging from tax policy to corruption and money laundering. He is the author of the book Corruption Around the World, which is one of the inspirations and references in my new book, Reimagining the World Without Corruption. Please welcome Vito Tanzi.
Welcome. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Hi, Vito, and thank you for this opportunity. In your book, Corruption Around the World, Causes, Consequences, Scopes, and Cures, you've discussed how corruption is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. Has it changed since you wrote the book in 1998?
Well, not really. Also there are maybe two major changes. One is that corruption has become a more obvious problem. If you were writing in the 90s, you were surprised by how little attention economists had given to corruption. Was not part of things that were discussed by economists. Then we started worrying about corruption. I think the Clinton administration was one of the first to introduce the code of ethics and so forth. So we are much more aware now of the problem. At the same time, as I've argued in a couple recent books, one the Termites of the State that was published by Cambridge University Press, policy have become much more complex, and complexity lends itself to corruption. The more complex policy becomes. Some bills that go to the U.S. Congress are 3,000 pages long. You ask yourself, who has read those bills? The people who vote for them have read them. They read the part that interests them, and most of these bills are written by assistants who are influenced by lobbyists, by the public vested interest, and so forth. So those are the two elements. One has gone, maybe we are more aware of the problem, and so we pay more attention to it. At the same time, maybe the institutional situation has made it easier to be a corrupt person.
But given that observation, Vito, can we compare corruption with COVID, the virus, or is it worse than the virus? And based on your study, the research and observations, have you found an antidote?
Well, if the COVID had remained one single virus, then would have been easier to deal with it. But yesterday or the day before, I went for another shot. My doctor advised me, because I'm over 65, obviously, and I was told to get another shot because there are more and more. COVID is expanding in multiple viruses, related one to the other, but different one from the other. And something similar is happening to corruption. Maybe the very explicit corruption of somebody stealing funds has become less common. But there's a more implicit corruption by modifying the law, reinterpreting regulations. So this kind of corruption may have become more prevalent because of complexity, as I said.
But have we found an antidote? Is there a cure? Because in your book, that was the last part.
Yeah, the antidotes, again, I don't know how easy it is. I'm in a forthcoming book. I have a new book coming out with the Cambridge University Press late in the next few months. Well, I argued very strongly for making policy simpler. And the policy can be simpler, but when you go for simplicity, you have to give up certain things. It's, as I say somewhere, if you want, you can either adopted what I call a mouth tuning to everybody, the same clothes to everybody, or you
Mhm.
can try to adopt an Armani suit to everybody. When you adopt Armani suit, become you can refine your policy, but becomes much more difficult to. And once you go that way, then corruption becomes easier. I become very much impressed in recent years by the fact maybe I should go back 1 minute. In 25 years ago, I was somewhat critical of Scandinavian countries because they spend too much, they had very high taxes and so forth. And in fact, I wrote a book in 2000, this public spending around the world was called, in which I made this point. I said, the country should not have a very high taxes. But then as the Scandinavian country made some changes, especially in the 90s. For example, the income tax, they introduced what was called a dual income tax. What is a dual income tax? They separated income from capital from income from labor. Income from labor, they kept taxing at marginal tax rate, which were progressive and based on labor income. Income from capital was changed completely. When you receive the capital income, the government automatically takes out a percentage. The percentage is the same for everybody, so one can complain that richer people and poorer people pay the same percentage
Mhm.
when they get the dividends and when they get profits and so forth. But this has simplified enormously the tax
Mhm.
system. As I always argued, sometime I argued, I've all the training in public finance that one can get, and I go to a tax accountant every year to prepare my income tax because I'm unable to follow all the regulations. To give you an idea, in the US there are 250 tax expenditure. Each one of these is very, very complex. How many people know these things? So
Mhm.
it's that's the problem.
But Vito, I'm interested to know through the years, the book you have published it in early in 1998. How would you describe how corruption has changed the world in the last 2 3 decades, for better or worse? And is it business corrupting the government, or the government through these regulations pushing us to the wall that lead us to bribe authorities to just make a living or a margin in our business? And can ordinary citizens make a difference if it's all about power, wealth, influence, which they don't have?
Yeah, let's who is influences whom. Well, the trouble that again, when policy become very complex, they don't become complex automatically because some policymaker wakes up in the morning and says, "I want to make them more complex." They become more complex because the policymaker are being pushed by lobbyists, and so you have the two-way street. The lobbyists with the vested interest are influencing the policymaker. The policymaker are getting gifts, are getting
Mhm.
good jobs when
Yes.
they retire, and so
Mhm.
forth. So there's a symbiotic the relationship
Mhm.
between the two. On what citizen can do, well, to the extent that they really are aware of the problem.
Mhm.
Very often they are not. Corruption
Mhm.
happens without anybody really noticing. And if they're aware of the problem, as long as they live in democracy, they can still throw the crooks out. And how much this happens, well, I don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical, because I
Mhm.
still see lots of acts of corruption around the world, almost anywhere.
But can you talk about an anti-corruption program or campaign that you can recall and you consider successful?
Yeah, well, again, I go back to the Scandinavian countries. If you go back to the 1980, 1990, those countries were beginning to have similar problems as other countries. And then they decided that they would do something very, very specific against that, and they simplified many laws. They cut down some some, for example, retirement law was very much simplified, and so forth. So they did things which, in my view, and at least according to what I read, has removed a lot of
Mhm.
corruption in those countries. And they are still, the strange thing, the interesting thing, they are still doing quite well in international competitiveness comparison. You know, they do well in freedom of individual freedom. They do well
Mhm.
in labor market participation. They do well. If you look at these indexes that come out regularly, they are always in the top 5, 6, 7 countries in the world, you know. So it's very strange for a country that have high taxes and high spending,
Mhm.
but they still do relatively well. If you look at the press in the US, if you increase taxes, always a disaster. Well, if it's a disaster under some circumstances, but not under others, you know.
But Vito, given the complexities and how things are getting more sophisticated, do you think this our anti-corruption campaigns or programs are catching up? Have we made any impact, or are we progressing? Are we actually making any improvements in our
Well,
fight against corruption?
I ask myself, if you did not have those campaigns, would it be
Hmm.
better or worse? For sure, would be
Hmm.
worse. You know, so in relative terms, I think that they are helping. You know, and probably as citizens, we should be more aware of them and should participate much more in them. We should throw out the crooks when you begin to read that a government has taken advantage, has not paid taxes or whatever people in the government. Then we should be more aware, and we should be more active in trying to change things. You know, how much we do that will depend on countries and depend
Hmm.
on circumstances. You know.
Yeah, I don't want to sound so idealist, but I need your words of wisdom. Is it possible for us to reimagine the world without corruption?
Well, first of all, we should keep imagining it. You know, it's good that we do. If we no longer imagine a world without corruption, then
Hmm.
corruption stops being a problem. You know, then we accept.
Hmm.
You know,
I
and
agree.
so that we should definitely imagine. And as I already said, there are things we can do. Simplification of laws is clearly one of these. Reporting of uh, of policies, it's always clearly, sometimes it's very difficult for citizens to get information on how our policies working. Access to information should always be available. So there are lots of things that we can do, and that to some extent we are doing in some countries. Not all countries are equally corrupt. The corruption indices, which are calculated every year, they show a huge
Hmm.
range. So clearly, some countries have been more active than others, and not because people. Well, maybe there's a tendency across countries to be more corrupt than others. I've become more and more aware of the difference between civilization and culture. You know, culture is a habit. Some society are tribal. So you help your tribe, even if what you're doing is not correct. Other countries are less tribal. So that again, I want to give a positive answer that policy can be changed and action can be successful to some extent. But we should not have dreams that one day you wake up in the morning and corruption has disappeared. Corruption was always with us, probably from thousands of years back to today. Will always be with us.
Hmm.
Even the countries I was mentioning. I've seen report of very rich people from Norway migrating to Switzerland because of
Hmm.
the taxes. This is you can consider this a form of corruption. So everybody's exposed to it, but our reaction to it can be different, depends on the social circumstances, depends on our moral instinct and so forth.
There's so much to discuss about corruption, and we have just started. Thank you very much, Vito, for your time. Thank you for joining us, Vito. And thank you for listening to this episode. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Asian Consulting Group YouTube channel. Let us know what topic you want to hear more about. Just message us in our social media accounts. Be the change that you want to see in the world. Be one of our thought leaders and game changers.